Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. Our next guest is someone you doubtless know. He is the most frequent guest by far, by a factor of some big number, on our nighttime show at 8 p.m. He's probably the most frequent guest on Fox News. We haven't checked, but he's in the running for sure, and there's a reason for that. Mark Steyn is a genius. We're not overselling that. There aren't many geniuses striding the earth, but Mark Steyn, in his particular way, is. And so we have him on, try to do it twice a week, every single week. And the thing about a Mark Steyn interview is that not only is none of it rehearsed, we never tell Mark Steyn what we're talking about. So every question is cold and by definition comes out completely of left field. You can throw Mark Steyn anything. You could say, how's Kamala Harris doing? Not so tough. You could say, how are the Seychelles Islands in January? Out of the park. It doesn't matter what you ask him. He has an informed, wise, and usually hilarious answer. No one else can do that. If you haven't seen Mark Steyn on our show, then you don't watch regularly. Here's what you're missing. So here you have Eric Swalwell on some kind of cheetah hunt with his coolies. It seems so old school for a progressive man like Eric Swalwell. What do you make of it?
Well, it is, and he's obviously taken off his shirt to intimidate his faithful native bearer, and the native bearer has clearly just said, 1,000 pardons, Effendi. I bow before your magnificent imperialist nipples. Is that the front hump of your camel, or are you just pleased to see me? I mean, literally the emperor's new clothes. Like, so to a fool, Joe Biden may look like a guy who spends most of his day sitting in the basement eating tapioca, but to the wise man, he's Cary Grant in that touch of mink. He has an effortless, natural style. I would be happy to pitch an eye-rolling hour every night on this channel for these kinds of stories.
He's also our crochet correspondent, and so he joins us now.
Well, I think she just made a rather remarkable confession there when she said, I've crocheted more Afghans than I can tell you. I believe that's a war crime under the Geneva Conventions, and probably the real reason why we're pulling out of Afghanistan. I had a staffer write it out for me on this piece of paper. But anyway, you make Jim Crow look like Nigel Peregrine Falcon. These days, there are much better movies, Tucker, over on CNN. You may recall this classic from Brian Stelter. He's been nominated at next month's Oscars. He's up against Jeffrey Toobin for Best Animated Shorts. So he just stands up. And he goes, it's 20 minutes before dawn on D-Day, and this 9-star general says to me, Mr. President, it's too dangerous for you to go in there. But I say, the Minutemen are taking on the Bengal Lancers. So I flew in on a glider from Diego Garcia, and we came under heavy fire from a group of whirling dervishes holed up in Bridget Bardot's apartment outside Euro Disney. And I said to them, I'm the first Biden in 1,000 years to go to college, so I know what it's like to be the best of the best. This was classic Joe Biden. He's back. His mojo has returned. His mojo knows what state it's in.
I just drooled on myself. I don't. Okay. I just want to alert our producers to take that, put it on a DVD, and sell it, and we'll give the money to charity. But that was unbelievable. I would vote for you for president after that. I just want to be completely honest. You hear that made me laugh the second time. You hear a sentence like that and you think there's no way he can land that thing. He's gonna crash on the side of a mountain. A sentence like that can't be completed. And every time it is. Mark Steyn, unbelievable. I'm not much for flattery, but that's unbelievable.
You know, I had several critical tweets after that saying there's no such thing as a 9-star general. Steyn doesn't know what he's talking about. The internet has made everyone incredibly literal.
Yes, it has, and no wiser. So people who watch our nighttime show regularly love you. They love you. And we know that from the numbers, but also from common sense and just running into people. I don't think they know that much about you. I never ask. We haven't even met that many times in real life, though I'm your greatest fan, as you can tell. To the extent you're comfortable, like, tell us where you're from. Like, what life produced that?
Well, I was born in the Wellesley Hospital in Toronto, which they tore down, not just because I was born there, but for various other reasons. So you can't go and visit it, and there'll never be a plaque there. My parents were Irish and Belgian. I was at...
Nationals? So they were from those countries?
Well, under British nationality law at that time, the concept of an Irish national was not universally recognised. But my mother, well, that's the difference. My Irish father was just like mooching around the colonies for a bit, and my Belgian mother was a foreigner, and her childhood memories were being taunted as a dirty DP, which was a displaced person, which is what they called people after the war. So, you know, an Irishman in Canada is not foreign, and a Belgian in Canada in those days was. So there's like subtle differences in the gradations of assimilation and that kind of thing. But I had a peripatetic childhood, and I wandered around, and I finally wound up in New Hampshire, mainly because...
Wait, stop. So you've elided over many years here. So you're born in Toronto in a hospital that no longer exists to parents who were not from Canada.
Yeah.
And then you go, where were you educated?
I was at, my bulk of my education was at King Edward School in England, which is J.R.R. Tolkien's thing. So when I say I was at the same school as the Lord of the Rings guy, people think I was at school in New Zealand, because unfortunately the film of Lord of the Rings has led everyone to believe... I mean, that's like 85% of New Zealand's economy is Lord of the Rings fans going to tour the actual part of New Zealand where J.R.R. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. And the fact that he wrote it, you know, the fact that the guy was from Warwickshire and he wrote it at Oxford and he was sitting in pubs telling it to C.S. Lewis has all been forgotten, and New Zealand's getting all the bang for the buck from that.
So has C.S. Lewis been forgotten?
Yeah.
How did you wind up at school in England?
Well, my parents, my father at one point wanted to go back to Ireland. He was restless for a while. He mainly liked France because of its Epicurean perfection.
Yes.
Which I sort of thought was a bit silly at the time, but I kind of got a bit more respect for that.
Is that you on the screen?
Yeah, that's with my father. He's, I think that's at the Toronto Zoo with a monkey. What I like about that is there's me with the monkey, and my father's just like holding his cigarette. Like, you could do that at the zoo.
An unfiltered cigarette draped over your shoulder. You don't see that a lot in family portraits now.
No, and I think that's quite... I'm cool with it, the monkey's cool with it.
And you're wearing something that's clearly 100% wool.
Yeah, I'm like...
And your father has a necktie on at the zoo. Now, you are not very old.
No.
But that looks like it was taken in a completely different age.
Yeah, it does look like a completely different age. I mean, my kids can't get over... The first thing, as you say, they can't get over why a man is wearing a necktie at the zoo. Then they can't get over the way the zoo is letting him hold the monkey with one hand and his cigarette with the other. The whole thing... There's like several different layers of hate crime going on.
No, I mean, that could be Bulawayo 1903.
Yeah. It's a completely lost world. And in some ways, I miss it. I think it speaks. I prefer. I would say I'm culturally conservative more than politically conservative, because a lot of conservative politicians drive me nuts. But I regret lost worlds, and I regret that my own childhood has become a lost world in what doesn't seem a long time ago.
I grew up in a very different place in a very different way, but it's also gone, and it makes me sad. So your parents at some point returned to Europe.
Yeah.
And you go with them, and that's how you wind up in boarding school in England?
Well, it's... Yeah, I mean, basically had the bulk of my education in the UK, in England, and my school was the last school, perhaps certainly in the UK and maybe even in the world, in which Latin was compulsory, for example, all the way to something like 16 or 17. So it was a serious school. And
did you board there?
No, I didn't board. I was a day pupil, and again, that's something like going on a long, whatever it was, a 20-mile train journey every day is not something that kids do on their own now and things. So I like that world. It was, we had to wear silly uniforms, so the rough kids in the city would occasionally want to beat the crap out of us. So I felt that was character forming too. That if you have to wear silly caps and blazers and boaters and in the summer and that kind of thing, that the rougher lads sort of give you a quick lesson in life, and so I feel it's character building to make a child.
Did they cane you?
Yeah, they had corporal. They had light corporal punishment, but it did exist. So. But I enjoyed. I wasn't very good at it, but I enjoyed the seriousness of the. I did Greek. I never went to university, and as you know, on Twitter, people always going, so, well, Steyn is completely unlettered. Why are we listening to him? Well, I can idu althis ho thrasaboulos ten technek epidek nutai kai epiten kephalen his stamenos. Which most people on Twitter can't do. That's, behold, again, Thrasaboulos shows off his technique while standing on his head. And that's a very useful sentence if you're in Greece. Unfortunately, in Greece, they don't speak ancient Greek, but, you might find an Albanian or Macedonian who recognizes it from his school. But I felt I liked high school education that I had was serious, and it wasn't serious for my, no disrespect to the particular school they went to, but it wasn't serious and demanding for my kids. It wore them out. My daughter had one of these. She went to visit another school officially. They had an exchange or something. So she goes to this high school in Vermont, and she's there for the day of gay silence, or over the crimes against gay people. And so she's sitting there in silence all day, so it's a rather frustrating day for her. And then she goes back to her own school the following day, and they'd scheduled the day of gay silence for that day too. So she had 2 days of gay silence in a row, but she didn't get Latin and she didn't get Greek, and it was, it's a different kind of education there.
Well, I mean, a serious high school education. I mean, you're one of the best educated guests we have, and one of the most best educated people I know, and you didn't go to college. And so maybe a system in which you're not expected, in which everyone is not expected to go to college, puts more emphasis on a primary education.
Well, I think that's
secondary education.
I think actually if you don't get K through 8 right, you can stay there to grade 28, grade 38, and it doesn't make any difference. That's the most important thing. And so all this thing, the whole discussion on education here, which is the biggest structural defect in the United States, is that, I think Biden just did it the other day. We need even more people to go to university for even longer. So, the problem is that they're expected to do a bachelor's degree in 4 years. Maybe if we made it 9 years, they'd finally get it right. The fact is, if you don't get K through 8 right, all the rest is a complete waste of time. And don't forget, in America, the average American in 1940 had an 8th grade education. America, the superpower, was built by 8th graders. It was 8th grade America that became the dominant military power, the dominant economic power, the dominant cultural power on the planet. And now we have 28th grade America, and it's all going to hell.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think education has become a racket, but I also think it's the actual I think it's an ancient seduction of civilizations, that civilizations soften, so that it's a natural process to that extent. It's not natural to soften over transgender bathrooms or pregnant men or that kind of thing. That's what makes it difficult, certainly for a satirist to observe, because it's a form of civilizational decline in its particulars that we haven't seen, but its outline would be familiar to the Romans or to anybody else, and I think that's where as I said, I'm culturally conservative. I've never been other than culturally conservative, and that's where you have frustrations with political conservatism, because it's so far behind when you get to all that stuff.
So why are you culturally conservative? What is it that you would like to conserve about the culture?
Well, I believe in the great Western inheritance, which means that you don't think of things. And when people go on about Russia, for example, yeah, Russia is a politically barbarous nation and has been for most of its history. But on the other hand, it's given us Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff and Gogol and Chekhov and Pushkin. Yeah, so it's a serious contributor to Western civilization. So clearly the Russian people have got something going for them. And I started as a disc jockey, and so I played, top 40 hits, but I always, I didn't live in that moment, even when I've had friends who were pop stars in both Quebec and the UK, and I like them as, I enjoy their company, and I'm happy they got to number 3 in the hit parade. But I wasn't ever someone who just lived in that in that moment, which I don't think is a conservative thing. I don't think it's conservative to get excited because Kanye West says something that appears to be contrary to the cultural ethos. And I always found the most pathetic thing was when dear old National Review used to run, I think they were an annual feature for a while, the 20 greatest conservative rock songs, because a rock song is not inherently. What they mean is that George Harrison is in the Beatles, and it's fantastic. And he's playing guitar there, and they have all these hits. And then the first tax return he has to fill in after he's become a pop star, he discovers that he has to pay 19 shillings in the pound income tax on his mega star earnings. And so he goes and writes Taxman, let me tell you how it will be. There's 19 for you and 1 for me and all that. And that's not a conservative. If a conservative pop star is someone who's thinking of moving to Switzerland because the tax rates are too high, it's pathetic and desperate to pretend that is somehow what being conservative is about.
I think you just summed up the magazine fairly effectively. Pathetic and desperate. Excuse me.
And that was in their butcher days.
Yeah, that was back when people read. So, to digress once more, because that's what I do for a living. Your first job was as a disc jockey. So you graduate.
Well, no, my first job was as a busboy at the Westbury Hotel in Toronto, and I'm not, that is a fine skill in itself, but I'm happy to do 20 minutes on being a busboy. But I can already feel television sets being switched off across the nation.
So you graduate high school, and where do you go? To do what? What are your plans?
Well, I had wanted to do classics at Oxford, at Merton College, Oxford. I would have had an entirely different life. I wanted to do that.
To do that meaning teach?
No, to study, to get a whatever it is, a bachelor's or whatever or I think at Oxford it's an MA. And I would have liked to have just gone to Oxford and done Greek and Latin, and my results were terrible. And in one of those, normally in that kind of situation, okay, well, you can't do classics, greats, I think they call it at Oxford, greats at Oxford, but, you know, why don't you do, you know, political science at Edinburgh or Belfast or something? And instead of that, I just said, nuts to this. And I paid, I think it was £59 for a budget flight one way to New York, got on the Greyhound after running out of money rather prematurely and sleeping under the statue of George VI at Niagara Falls, the folds of his robe in stone. They'll shelter you from the wind and rain. And it's a beautiful statue, actually. But on the Canadian side, obviously, not the American.
I assume it's been torn down by now, but yes, I bet it was.
If it's not, that's one of the advantages. Sometimes these slave owners, just their garb, garb carved in stone, will protect you from the elements if you're looking for somewhere to sleep. That's one reason. If you need another one, that's another reason not to tear these statues down. After that, I wound up on not terribly important radio stations, just playing whatever. I mean, I once wrote to a radio station offering my services, thinking it was a kind. It was a kind of easy listening adult contemporary, Barbra Streisand singing "You Don't Bring Me Flowers," that kind of thing. And I got there, and I discovered, like 10 minutes into the interview, I divined that it was actually for a classical show, and I didn't know a lot about classical music, but I bluffed my way through the interview and got the show. And I think that's, I never regretted taking jobs where you acquire knowledge, and I think that's quite a good.
So how long were you a disc jockey?
Well, I would guess I was a disc jockey for something like 3 or 4 years. I had the pleasure of telling your boss, Mr. Murdoch, this once when he gave me an award. I got fired in a humiliating way. And you know, when you go into radio stations, in reception, they've got like portraits of the disc jockeys sitting behind the girl at the desk. And as I was fired and told to leave the building, and I'm walking out, the girl at the desk just unhooks my portrait and hands it to me. So I'm like walking out with my official portrait that nobody has any use for, and just the empty nails. It was a very humiliating thing. And I wrote a piece. I wrote a droll column and just mailed it to the Times of London, thousands of miles away. And 4 weeks later, Mr. Murdoch sent me a check for £100, and I thought, this is great. I've never had a 3-figure check before. I'll be able to live on this for the next 3 months. And of course, I'd spent it in 48 hours, so then I had to write another piece and mail it to Mr. Murdoch, and that becomes a habit, as you know, in the journalism profession.
So you just became a journalist out of desperation?
All the people I admire, and that's again what I find so odd about America, this idea that journalism is a calling. All the people I ever knew had only gone into journalism because they were completely desperate. I knew a guy who used to write...
That's why I went into it?
Yeah. Well, I knew a guy who he wrote for the Nairobi Times, and he told me that I said, oh, that's fantastic. I think he was going to give me some inspiring story on how he got into journalism. He said, no. He goes, my father left me a copper mine in Zambia, and then the government nationalized all the all the copper mines, and so I was a broke loser. And when you've got no skills, when you've got nothing you can do, writing is about the only thing that you can do. And that is why they've wrecked it here in the United States by making it just another outpost of American over-credentialism.
Right, like being a dental hygienist.
Yeah. And it's absolutely pathetic. There was a neighbor of mine in New Hampshire. Now, she lived in the family homestead. Her family had arrived in 1763, hacked their way through the woods, built the building they live in. They owned it free and clear. She wanted to work for the Atlantic Monthly, for which at the time I write. So she wanted to go to Columbia Journalism School And they would have mortgaged their farmhouse that their great whatever built in 1763, and for the privilege of editing my copy, right? So in other words, the editor has to go to Columbia Journalism School and take out a $250,000 loan to edit a guy who left school at 18 and bummed around as a disc jockey. That's the over-credentialization of American life.
Did she do it?
No, because I said to her, this is too sad. This is ridiculous. There's nothing. I mean, the journalism thing is particularly. People go and they take $250,000 in debt for a job that these days pays $30,000 a year if you're lucky. It's completely ridiculous, and it's killed American writing. People sometimes say, why does Carlson have Steyn on? Every time I switch on TV or I pick up a magazine, there's all these people from the UK, from Canada, from Australia. The late night shows, that's a clean sweep by the British Commonwealth, from some relatively talented Canadians, the Scots guy who was on late night for a while, all the way to Trevor Noah from South Africa, who hasn't actually said anything funny since he landed in America. But it's a clean sweep for the British Commonwealth. The same thing with a lot of, Christopher Hitchens and co in the newspapers, because I think institutions like Columbia Journalism School have actually just killed American writing.
I've never hired a single person from journalism school, and I never would. And I only went into journalism because I was getting married and I had to get a job. And the two places I applied, I wanted to teach or work for the government, and both turned me down. So I was a desperate man, and writing is. Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. So then you start writing for the Times of London.
Yeah, and I wrote for,
which is kind of at the top of the pile.
Well, the interesting thing to me, again, which I could never, I don't want to keep bashing, I'm the least anti-American person on the planet in many ways, but the worst aspect of America is its press. And what I always loved about London is the most competitive newspaper market in the world. So if you write, people are poaching you back and forth. It's not even a particularly political thing, because the Guardian likes to have its token right, well, and certainly did back then, like to have its token right-wingers just to rile people up. Same thing when I wrote for the National Post in Toronto, but nobody in America thinks Toronto is a consequential town, but it has a competitive newspaper market. So does Montreal. And so do most parts of the world, and some seriously competitive ones, which by the time you get to Pakistan, which is why their newspapers are more readable than America's.
Dawn.
Yeah, exactly. Dawn.
I spent a lot of time reading Dawn in Islamabad.
Yeah. And Dawn is a better read than the New York Times.
I completely agree with that. And more interesting.
Yeah, and the New York, it is actually more interesting. And what I could never get over here is the way the funny, like if you opened up the op-ed page of the New York Times, there'd be a serious column in at the top and the serious column in the bottom left-hand corner, and then tucked away in the bottom right-hand corner, they'd have the designated funny guy, who was supposed to be funny about barcode scanners in supermarkets and things like that. And I always thought, no, if you're going to be funny, you should be able to be funny about war and pestilence and all the heavyweight things.
Yes. And
just making jokes about barcode scanners in supermarkets for 30 years until they put you out to pasture, like the so-called funny columns in American papers. I could never get over that sealing it off, sealing 90% of life off from what the designated humor columnist is allowed to be funny about. The American newspapering killed itself.
Yeah, and it deserves to die, that's for sure. One of the things the Brits are funny about that's not even comprehensible to the American news consumer is obituaries. There's this amazing tradition of obituaries in English language newspapers around the world, other than the United States. You were one of the great the great obituary writers. Tell us what an obituary should be, and then recall, if you will, some of your favorites.
Well, it's true that, again, that tradition doesn't exist here. I find there's the thing they do at the New York Times is they bank obituaries, so that, like, you're not dead yet, but assuredly there's somewhere at the New York Times there's an obituary for you on file, and
I'm sure it's pretty positive,
and it's and it's great, it's terrific, and by the time it's published 45, 50 years hence, the guy who wrote it will be dead,
yes.
But they'll still run it, and they'll, well, can you just instead of he died at 38, he died at 112. They'll just like make that small correction. But otherwise it'll run. And I could never do that. I could never actually write about anyone who hadn't yet died.
They're called advanced obits.
Yeah, and I could never do that, and I hated the concept. And the other thing I think is you always have to have a certain sympathy. Even you have to at least have the not sympathy but empathy, which is a most abused word these days, but you have to be able to understand the guy in his own terms, which is, I think, is difficult if he's just like a designated bad guy. Like, I wrote an obituary about a Utah polygamist, and the Atlantic, who'd commissioned it, had expected me just to, piss all over the guy. And in fact, when you read about his life and the choices he made, you have to understand them, which of course is the great issue today, because, we take some guy who died in 1548 and so he doesn't hold the correct views for our moment, and so he's an evil being. You have to understand people in the context of their time.
Can I ask you to pause, because I'd love an answer to this. So I'm not defending polygamy, which I don't practice and I oppose and all that normal caveats, but the same people who are telling you that the nuclear family is completely outdated and any combination is not only cool but preferable to the nuclear family are deeply offended by polygamy. I once raised a defense of a polygamist, not because I'm for polygamy, but because, like, I don't know, having a bunch of kids, taking responsibility for them, I'm for that.
Yeah.
And wow, I got attacked. Why is polygamy the one family arrangement that just sets them off?
Well, because here it's traditionally associated with unfashionable people. Basically, if you say the word polygamy to most Americans, they're thinking of some stern-faced patriarch in Utah,
right,
with 5 wives. Now, the fact is, statistically speaking, in the Western world, the main practitioners of polygamy these days are Muslims, and their arrangements are de facto recognized by, for example, welfare in France, welfare in Ontario, for the purposes of inheritance tax in the United Kingdom, and that kind of polygamy, nobody wants to go anywhere near. Now, as you point out, the left is completely incoherent on this, because they're all for the same-sex marriage, so the sex of the participants doesn't make any difference. Therefore, they say, no. It's like man taking a wife. That's not what it's about. It's about expressing your commitment and your love for each other. Well, if the sex of the participants doesn't make any difference, why should the number of the participants make any difference?
I have made this case. They go crazy when you make the case.
Yeah.
But I don't really have any kind of vested interest in it either way. I think it's just interesting. I'm
not in favor of polygamy, but if anything can be anything, which is where we are now, so if a man can be a woman and then marry another woman, or marry a so-called pregnant man or whatever, then why is it that the polygamists are uniquely out of favor? And because they're associated with Utah and a particular kind of
I think that's right. Because I mean, my view is if a professional athlete can have 9 kids out of wedlock and brag about it, take responsibility for none of them. No. Here you have someone who's saying, no, these are my children. I'm their father. I'm married to their mothers.
Right.
Look, again, I'm not doing it. I'm not into it. But you're taking responsibility for the kids. Why shouldn't we applaud that? No, send them to jail.
Well, that's basically what they say. Well, on the one hand, you have these like people who suddenly can become worldwide icons, and they've like knocked up a selection of baby mamas, and so there's all kinds of former girlfriends, partners, all these euphemisms.
It's always a fiance.
Yeah.
When they die, it's always a fiance. Right, yeah. We were about to get married. I didn't know.
Yeah. And they're all, but they are all basically euphemisms for a man who left huge amounts of human wreckage in his wake.
Right.
But as you say, some guy in Utah, he's taken care of all the children by all his wives. That guy is deserving of unique scorn. And it's just, the whole point about the leftist worldview is it doesn't have to cohere because they have the power calculation.
Right.
And so if you leave, it's true with what's going up gone up in Canada this summer, where dozens of churches have been burned, and dozens of Catholic churches. And if you heard that dozens of Christian churches had been burned, you'd say, oh, well, what is this? Is this a story out of Sudan or Pakistan or whatever? Or maybe the wake of the Iraq war, where the Christian community got decimated on our watch. No, it's all happening in Canada, Alberta and Manitoba. It's not a story in Canada. Dozens of churches burn, and it's not a story. Whereas if you, for example, left rashers of Canadian bacon on the step of a mosque, that would be a story for weeks. So the leftist worldview is always the power calculation. What belongs to the past? Traditional ideas about of traditional churches, traditional institutions, and what belongs to the Rainbow Coalition of the future. And it's just a power calculation.
How did you get to America? You've lived and traveled in more countries, I think, than anybody I know who's not a professional diplomat. I can never mention a country that you haven't been to, whose political system you don't understand, whose prime minister you don't know personally. It's almost unbelievable, and I don't think you're making it up. And then you wind up in rural America, like real rural America.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say, but I know where you live. And I'm familiar with the town, actually, and it's real rural America. It's not. You know what I mean? Woodstock, Vermont, or something. You live in actual rural America.
Yeah.
Probably the only person from away in your town. How the hell did you wind up there?
Well, I was on an Amtrak overnight train from Montreal to New York that broke down in the middle of the night. And so they throw us all off the train. Amtrak's ridiculous, averages, I believe it averages, or it did before they cancelled it, 16 miles an hour between Montreal and White River Junction.
It's a very modern country we live in.
Yeah, so you could actually bicycle. You could out-bicycle the Amtrak Montrealer. And they throw us all off the train, and eventually they send a little van to take us to an inn. And I just drew the curtains in the morning, looked at them, I thought, oh, it's quite nice here. I'd never really thought about it. It was just somewhere you pass through en route from A to B. And I had the classic disastrous real estate deal where I bought a 200-year-old farmhouse that needed 200 years of work on it. So I'd done it in a stupid way because I thought, oh, this would be nice for a couple of ski weekends, maybe a week at Christmas. And of course, it's just, continuous. And in the course of that, I discovered what Tocqueville discovered, that small-town government in northern New England is the best form of government that man has yet devised. If you've got a problem, and this is why people who think it's all about if you're in Latin America, it's all about the president. If you're in a town and you don't like critical race theory, look, there's only 400 adults in the town. You can make a fuss about it. Well, you can call the guy, you can call the chairman of the school board because he's in the phone book and tell him you don't like critical race theory. It's not like you have to call, some head office in Washington or in Europe called the European Union in Brussels, it's one of your neighbours. And if you don't like what your neighbour's doing, you can go to school board meetings and force him to change it. And if he doesn't change it, you can run for school board. And it's not as good as it was because there have been too many. I mean, one of the untold statistical phenomena has been the consolidation of school districts over the last 80 or so years in America. And that's generally delivered them just into the hands of more centralized control and more unionization and all the rest of it. But this is still, of all the places I've lived, it's the only place where if you wake up in the morning and you go down the hill and the road hasn't been plowed, you can call your town highway agent and demand to know why it hasn't been plowed. If that happens to you in Provence, good luck getting hold of somebody in Paris to come and fix your road. You know.
What do they think of you in your little town?
Well,
you're clearly not from there. I mean, you can't kind of hide that.
Yeah, no, and there are people who, you know, which I don't. I turned down a gig on, I think it was Vermont Public Radio. I'd had to do something for Australian radio, and they found me a studio at King Arthur Flower in Norwich, Vermont, in the basement where Vermont Public Radio, their thing. And the lady at the end, she was listening, she said, "Oh, yeah, you're quite good. Would you like to do commentaries on Vermont Public Radio? We'll give you $50 a time." And I said, no, because if I was a listener to Vermont Public Radio, I want to wake up and hear me every morning. I mean, I understand that in the end, people like their communities. Cultural continuity is important. So you can have one guy like me in a town who like comes down to the general store and talks in a weird accent, but he's trying in a vaguely pathetic way to fit in. You know, so I wear plaid when I'm in New Hampshire, and I have a pickup truck, and I'm trying my best. But like one of the guys was working on my house, he went in, he had to move my truck. So he goes and climbs in the truck, he starts the ignition, drives it down the hill to get it out of the way, and immediately he switches on the ignition. The Judy Garland CD I have in the truck comes on, and he's going, "Oh my God, I can't," you know, and I was doing so well. I wore the plaid, I had the pickup truck, but I had the Judy Garland CD. And, you know, that's the main reason I have a pickup truck is because it's actually very good for carrying the larger Judy Garland box sets in it. You know, it's... so at a certain, you know, you can fake it up to a certain point, but there's always a giveaway.
Northern New England is, you know, its own world. It's set apart from the rest of the country. It's huge, the largest forest in the continental United States is there. But it has this kind of weird cultural connection to parts of the South. And country music is a thing in Northern New England, a lot of country music. Right. Have you fallen for that? I like old time. Before country, it was country, because country music now is basically like 1970s rock, as I think of it. And my preference for that would be the earlier. I love Hank Williams. I think Hank Williams is a brilliant songwriter, and I like that generation. And before country and western, it was what they called hillbilly music, and I like a lot of that, and I like a lot of western swing from Texas. But I don't believe, you know, the thing about conservatism is, in the end, it's about individuals and individual taste, and so I don't believe that it's useful to say, well, this is conservative culture, and this isn't, because if you look at it, in the end, like NASCAR does as much pandering as the New York City Ballet, and in fact, when you think of it, you know, the New York City Ballet has screwed over conservatives less than NASCAR has with its pandering. So I respect these things, but I don't like
I don't like the fakeness of it. When I used to guest host for Rush was brilliantly attuned to the sort of cultural rhythms of America, and I didn't think it's helpful to me I used to joke. I mean, he introduced me once to a very famous American footballer, but he said Steyn knows nothing about American sports, because I'm into rugby or whatever, and it's not worth trying to fake it. And so on the day after the Super Bowl or whatever, when I was on Rush, I would always be perfectly honest. I'd say, I don't, or I'd say, well, I thought it was all going great until the 7th inning stretch when they sang "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," and then I'd realise I'd gotten too far out on the branch and I'd plummeted like Wile E. Coyote into the pit below. I think that fake thing, just let people, cultural conservative, this is where people don't understand something like Make America Great Again. They think it's sort of racist, and no, Trump's position was that Sweden should make Sweden great again.
Of course.
And Tajikistan should make Tajikistan great again, and Papua New Guinea should make Papua New Guinea great again. That you should have enough cultural confidence in whatever's your bag, just to understand that it's not about this one-size-fits-all thing.
Are you going to stay?
Oh yeah. I think when you fall in love with a place. I mean, I fell in love with my corner of New Hampshire initially because of its natural beauty, and I like the way the clapboard houses look so snug, and it's the perfect architectural style for fitting into the mountains and the lakes and all the rest of it. And then as I said, I discovered town government, and I thought that I loved going to town meeting. I couldn't vote. And the town clerk always kept her beady eye on me,
lest you try.
Yes, but I was fascinated by. They had there was a discussion about putting a fence around the town dump. You know these things. They're all these things, and it was like the fence was $1,200, and all these sort of old timers. Well, I agree we should have a fence, but I don't think we've got a $1,200 problem here. And eventually it would go through for like $500 after we'd talked about it for 3 hours or whatever. And that's absolutely right. And the problem here is that you talk about 3 hours and you get the $1,200 fence down to $500. And then at the national level, you have a $3.5 trillion, $4.5 trillion, $7.8 trillion budget for which there is no scrutiny whatsoever. And, American national government doesn't work because the congressional districts are now so populous that they don't represent the people, they represent the handful of players in each district who know how to get the guys on the phone. So it doesn't work. It doesn't work at the $7.8 trillion level, but it works. It still works.
So scale matters. Bigness is bad.
Yeah. And I think that the minute you have big government doesn't just mean big government. It means that it's no longer, at a certain point, it can no longer be representative of the people. So if you have 300 and something million under the congressional system. And I say this with respect to India, which is the world's largest democracy, and where right now I would adjudge that, federalism in India works better than federalism in the United States. But the minute you have these, don't forget, like the New Hampshire House has as many representatives more or less as the British House of Commons. And so for a 60th of the population, more or less. And that's, so a representative there, if he doesn't necessarily know all the people he represents by name, he knows a significant chunk of them.
So you've lived all over the world. I think you still may. I'm not going to ask you, but in the 5 years you've been doing our show, there's always a 2 or 3 month period where you just disappear. I've never asked you where you go. We just get a call saying, Mark Steyn's not available for the next couple of months. Where is he? I'm not going to say. So I'm not going to ask you now.
Yeah.
But I suspect...
I'm actually just around the corner from the Fox DC bureau, face down in the Coke and Hookers. But I try to make
You're
it
on a
sound
bender.
as if, but I try to make it sound as if it's a little bit more exotic.
I suspect you're in foreign countries. That's what I have heard. I've never, again, because I'm indirect too, just like you, I've never asked. I'm not going to ask now.
Yeah.
But you have a lot of perspective on countries. I guess that's the point I'm making. What are the things that America should watch out for going forward? What are the real threats, do you think?
Well, just to say why that is, I think at a certain point you have to go and see places for yourself.
I absolutely agree with that.
And I think that's particularly true if you're in the media. I mean, you know that a lot of what the media do is phony. So 9/11 happens, and within 10 days, every commentator is an expert in the fierce Pushtun goat herd and all the rest. They'd never heard the word Pushtun 10 days earlier, but now suddenly they have to appear as experts in it. And I never particularly cared for that, so I like to go and actually get a grip on those places firsthand, which I always like to do, just to reassure myself. And at this particular time, to go to sort of circuitously answer your question, my problem right now is that Western civilization is sliding off a cliff, and most people in the Western world aren't even aware of that, which is tragic. So how do you stop it if they're not even aware of it? And one thing I've noticed, and you travel to these places, that actually the Western world right now gets more west the further east you go.
That is so true.
So that by the time you wind up if you're having dinner with a politician in the Baltic states or in Slovakia or Hungary, they're talking like reasonably normal people.
That's right.
Who, when they discuss politics, are calculating the national interest of the Czech Republic or Estonia or wherever.
We're going to Budapest next week for this exact reason.
Yeah. And you will find that if you encounter any of the wackiness in Budapest, it's because, about pregnant men or transgender bathrooms, it's because it came from America. So you have America as the absolute craziest, then you have Britannia and her lion cubs, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as the second tier crazies, because, Canada likes to take up every bad American idea like 2 years later. In Britain, the thing is just to mock and jeer and hoot at the crazy Americans and then take it up even more insanely, which is why J.K. Rowling is getting beaten up on Twitter every day for being a transphobe or whatever. And then you get to Western Europe, and you get to France, where Macron says, we're not taking down a single statue or changing a single street name, because they're all part of our history. And he just said that, and I got no use for Macron. He's like this dinky little Euro globalist. But he made the whole statue toppling thing go away just with that sentence. And he regards wokeism as an existential threat to the French Republic. And he has education ministers in the French education ministry who will say that. You can't find anybody in the Department of Education in Washington to say it, but you can find a French civil servant to say it. And then you go further east and you get to what used to be the Iron Curtain, and behind there, they've recovered their freedom recently enough to know what all this toxic garbage is about. And I think I don't understand. At some point, American conservatism which is desperately stale and tired at the official level, at the think tank level, and at the conservative magazine level, if you can still find one. has to actually confront that head on as to why they're having absolutely no, it's interesting to me, all the three phenomena of the pushback, the Tea Party in whatever it was, 2009, and then Trump in 2015, and now these people showing up at school boards and being mad over critical race theory. All these three phenomena had nothing to do with the conservative establishment, whether political or whether the think tanks. So that should tell you something. That should tell those guys about the disconnect.
But then the Heritage Foundation still exists. And it's got a budget, I believe, is hundreds of millions of dollars a year.
Yeah.
Why is that? If you've got 40 years of total uselessness under your belt, why do you persist?
I honestly, I think of it in a way a bit like the contemporary art market in New York, which, as you know, is crazier than anywhere on the planet, as we've just seen with, $500,000 for Hunter Biden. But clearly there's a lot of excess cash in the system.
Right.
And those rich guys, pay $500,000 for a Hunter Biden. They might otherwise just be putting it up their nose or whatever. Who knows what they'd be doing with it? And I think at a certain level, a lot of that think tank establishment is like that. And nothing. It's a comfortable world. And none of the, as you said, I live in a part of America that's not glamorous, even in northern New England terms. I don't have a compound or at Kennebunkport. I'm not in a converted inn in Woodstock, Vermont, or those kind. David French. Do you remember David French? He was the guy at National Review.
Vaguely. That
Bill Kristol, your old friend, had decided was going to be the challenger to Trump.
Oh, right.
Which again, no sane person would ever entertain. I had a rather cheap line that, David French has all the qualities of leadership except followers, which is a cruel and catty and bitchy and malicious line, but happens to have the great merit of truth. And so Bill Kristol, because David French doesn't know whether he wants to run for president. He's doing his Hamlet routine. And so Bill Kristol flies him up to Woodstock, Vermont, and they hole up there for a weekend to try and talk David French into running against Donald Trump. And the fact that they picked Woodstock, Vermont, because if you go 50 miles north, south, east, or west, you will see ruin and you will see wreckage.
Go to St. Johnsbury.
Yes. St. Johnsbury, where as somebody said a couple of years ago, there are more people at the needle sharing clinic than at the farmers market. These are ruined. My daughter started at McGill in Montreal at university there, and I drove her up there and we had dinner and we're walking through the town late at night, and I said to her, this is your first time away. You've led a really sheltered life in small town New England. You've got to be serious now. You're in a big town. There's all kinds of predators and all that. And she goes to me, "Oh, Dad, there's less crime here than in St. Johnsbury." And she's, businesses are broken into in St. J every night.
I know.
And Bill Kristol has no awareness of this. And so he has his pushback against Donald Trump. He goes to Woodstock, Vermont. The next time he organizes a thing against Donald Trump, he actually does the Spectre board meeting scene from James Bond, where they're all meeting in the hollowed out volcano. He flies the donor class into a private island off, I think it was off the Carolina coast. Can't remember whether it's north or south. To some luxurious thing. And Bill Kristol is actually sitting around in the hollowed out volcano with the, 15 biggest donors to the Republican Party plotting how they can engineer things so that Bill Kristol can press the button and lower Trump into the shark tank, and which would not go well for the shark, by the way. I just don't how if you drive around America, you cannot not be aware of how these towns have ceased to function, and of how you have downward mobility, which is the opposite of the American dream. The American dream is, oh yeah, I arrived at Ellis Island and I was penniless and I was living in a tenement on the Lower East Side, and then my kid moved uptown and my grandson became a doctor and got a place in Westchester County. Then, you know, my great-grandson goes to Harvard and becomes an environmental lawyer, shutting down all the dams in California, and the cycle begins again. But if you don't have upward mobility, you don't have the American dream. I mean, people were, I was a peasant in the 12th century, and my great-grandson was a peasant in the 14th century, and his great-grandson was a peasant in the 16th century, and eventually we think, to hell with this, let's get on the boat and go to America. So if you now have generational downward mobility, you've got the opposite of America going on right there.
It's just fascinating to me that all of this began, you could have been anywhere because your train broke down.
Well, you know, it's all like that. My whatever it was, great grandparents, I think it was, they were in Odessa, and they sold up everything. They wanted to get out of Tsarist Russia, and they sold up everything, and they bought tickets for New York. And the boat put in on the Irish coast en route to America, and they looked out the portholes and they saw hovels, but they weren't like hovels like back in Russia. Some of them were like 2-story hovels. So they thought, this must be the New York skyscrapers we've heard about. And they got off the boat thinking that they were in New York. And eventually some obliging Irishman said, oh, no, we don't have the skyscrapers like they have in New York. We've got, sure, there's a feed store. There's a 3-story feed store downtown, but that's about the only thing we have. And by that time, the boat was sailing to New York, and so they were stuck in Ireland. And I told that to an anti-immigration advocate here in the US. He said, that's the saddest immigration story I've ever heard. And,
did they stay?
Yeah, they did stay, and actually they did very well. My great aunt, who became a rather distinguished Irish painter, she did the illustrations for original illustrations for James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake,
no way.
and my other great aunt, he was a big IRA guy. He was actually an Irish Republican at a time when, years before anybody else was an Irish Republican, and got a big IRA military funeral. So they did well there. But, basically I took a century or whatever it was to basically catch up with where they should have been back in the 1890s. It's and actually, I think if you are, there's always a sense of regret that it becomes necessary to move. I mean, I don't mean necessary in legal term, refugee or whatever, but that an immigrant always, the part you left behind, and the reason, if you think about that seriously, you want what the Statue of Liberty is, which is liberty reaching her beacon out to the world, to shine upon the world, so that people adopt American ideas and people people understand the flaws in their own system and correct the flaws in their system. And instead, we stapled a third-rate poem to the bottom of the statue and turned it into a statue of immigration, which is a completely different thing. But I don't see what's humane and compassionate about denuding developing countries of their best and brightest. And I don't see there's anything humane or kindly about that at all.
No, it's awful. Carlson Tonight, happy Monday. The dominant rumor on the internet over the weekend was that Donald Trump will soon be indicted, possibly even handcuffed on camera. Is that true? We can't say. We do know that Trump is the subject of a grand jury investigation in Manhattan. That's a city that voted against Donald Trump by almost 80% in the last presidential election. We also know that the grand jury was impaneled by a Soros-funded DA called Alvin Bragg, who looks and acts like a Tawana Brawley-era Al Sharpton. So we would assume, on the basis of that evidence, that it's pretty likely Trump does get charged with something at some point. But charged with what? That's the question that should matter. In a free country, laws are universal. Laws apply to all citizens equally, precisely because all citizens are considered equal. For generations, this was very obvious to American liberals. In fact, it was the basis of their worldview. That was back when liberals opposed Jim Crow and were not trying to reinstate it as something called equity. We are not liberals, but we retain the traditional American view, which is that laws must be applied equally, or else they're not laws at all. Justice must be blind, or else it is tyranny. So we spent the day with the help of a lawyer on our staff trying to assess the likely charges against Donald Trump. And here's what we found. 8 years ago, as he was running for president, Trump paid a porn actress called Stormy Daniels $130,000. Daniels alleged that she and Trump had at one point had sex. Trump denied that. He still denies it. But in exchange for promising not to repeat that claim in public, Trump, through his then attorney, Michael Cohen, sent Stormy Daniels a check. Was that legal? Well, we can answer that question. Because there was a campaign in progress at the time, officials at the Federal Election Commission later examined the transaction between Trump and Stormy Daniels. Federal investigators concluded that nothing criminal had taken place. And in fact, settlements like this, whatever you think of them, are common, both among famous people, celebrities, and in corporate America. The result is usually known as an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. In this case, you can believe whatever side you want to believe, but paying people not to talk about things, hush money, is ordinary in modern America. According to the FEC, there was no need for Donald Trump to report his payments to Stormy Daniels, nor was the money that he sent her through his attorney subject to campaign finance limitations. The FEC determined the entire thing was a personal expenditure. It clearly was. So what is the crime here? Well, the media don't seem very interested in finding out. This is Donald Trump. He's a criminal. Everything he does is a crime. Watch.
Simply because he may have committed worse crimes, you don't let him off of lesser crimes. If you are, for example, seeking a prosecution for murder, if the guy gets caught drunk driving in another context before that, you don't just let him go because you have bigger fish to fry.
Nobody is above the law, including Donald Trump. It doesn't matter that this is kind of a minor crime compared to some of the other allegations.
A crime is a crime is a crime is a crime. That's what anybody prosecuting or a judge would say.
A crime is a crime is a crime, as Mika said. An indictment is an indictment is an indictment. When I hear people saying this is much ado about nothing, I think about all the members of Congress I served with and understanding every single one of them would have been charged and sent to jail had they done this.
I was reading the Bible, which said that a man sows, that he may also reap.
Joe Scarborough, ladies and gentlemen, telling us what a crime is. A crime with a woman. Okay. There's Al Sharpton lecturing us about the Bible. It's hilarious. Oh, the hypocrisy. But it didn't really answer the question. Why are we handcuffing Donald Trump? Liberals don't seem to care at all as long as it happens, as long as Trump gets handcuffed. But in fact, there's plenty of evidence that Trump committed no crime in sending money to Stormy Daniels. We don't have to guess. Consider the case of former North Carolina Senator John Edwards. Edwards was often described as a fiery liberal, but in fact he was a populist. He ran for president twice, and in the process infuriated the leaders of the Democratic Party by talking way too much about income inequality. They really hated him for that. Long after Edwards left office, Barack Obama's DOJ charged him with federal finance violations. So the premise of the case against John Edwards was that he had received $1 million in gifts and that he spent that money in hush money payments to his mistress, with whom he later had a child. Obama's DOJ argued that the money that Edwards sent to his girlfriend amounted to campaign contributions. Edwards never reported that money, so Obama's DOJ tried to send him to prison. Well, in the end, the case fell apart under the weight of its own incoherence. So Obama's lawyers argued that any payment that could conceivably help a political candidate politically is by definition a campaign expenditure. There's no law that says that, by the way, they just made it up. But if you think about it for a second, it doesn't make sense. If that were true, flip it around. It would mean that candidates could use donor money and also taxpayer money in the form of federal matching funds to pay for any personal expense as long as that expense could conceivably benefit them politically. So candidates could take federal matching funds, tax dollars, to buy Ferraris as long as they argued those Ferraris would appear in campaign ads, et cetera, et cetera. It's nonsensical. So not surprisingly, John Edwards was acquitted in that case. It was a humiliating defeat for the Obama administration, but it also sent a clear message and set a precedent which Alvin Bragg apparently is ignoring. So we don't know that an indictment's coming, as noted, and if it does come, we're not sure what it's going to say. We haven't seen it. But if Trump is indicted for sending money to Stormy Daniels, well, you'll be watching the abuse of law enforcement power. Oh, but you can't complain about it. Because as Congresswoman Maxine Waters has explained, political protests staged on behalf of Donald Trump are not constitutionally protected. They're domestic terrorism. Watch.
This is Donald Trump sending messages out to domestic terrorists that he's worked with and he helped to organize for the invasion of the Capitol on January 5th. He's sending out a message to them to get ready to protest any arrests, indictments, etc. that he may have. So he's basically talking to the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, QAnon, KKK.
Oh, January 6th. The only really organized group on January 6th was the FBI, of course. But consider the idea and where it's coming from. This is Maxine Waters. This is the lady who cheered on the LA race riots 3 decades ago. This is the very same person who just a few years ago said, and we're quoting, if you see anybody from the Trump cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, she's very old, get out and create a crowd. And you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere. Basically necklace them. Okay, Maxine Waters. But she's a Democrat, so this is just a civil rights exercise. She's protected from domestic terrorism charges. And Alvin Bragg is too. He's a Democrat. And you should know, we don't want to impugn his character or anything. We don't want to suggest that there's a connection between politics and the indictment of Donald Trump. But Alvin Bragg did run for office promising, as a campaign promise, to indict Donald Trump. We're not guessing. He gave televised interviews about it. Watch.
All right, so newspaper reports today say we could expect to see an indictment to be handed down against Donald Trump soon. Any thoughts on how you would handle such a high-profile case?
Certainly throughout my career, I've gone wherever the facts have taken me. And the types of allegations that have been reported publicly, valuation of assets, perhaps the use of shell companies, tax fraud. I've done all these sort of cases. I've tried a mortgage fraud case. I've tried one of the most significant money laundering cases out in the New York region. So of all the candidates, I sort of stand at the ready with all the tools in the toolkit.
Yeah, we're going to go after Trump. And by the way, he listed some real crimes there, and they have spent years trying to pin those crimes on Trump. They even got his tax returns illegally, and they found none of them. Not an offense of Trump, just true. So we wind up with this, which is piddling. But what's interesting is even as Bragg has been single-mindedly focused, Bragg, a graduate of Harvard College, on Donald Trump and his crimes, sending money to a porn star, he has been not only ignoring real crimes, but downgrading felonies to misdemeanors and letting actual violent criminals out of jail as quickly as possible. On his first day in office, Bragg, consistent with the ideas of the man who paid for his campaign, George Soros, issued a memo explaining his office will, quote, not seek a carceral sentence except in cases involving homicides, economic crimes, and a small number of felonies. Now, that was great news for people who commit violent felonies, including rapists like Justin Washington. Washington struck a deal with Bragg that allowed him to serve just 30 days in jail under the theory that his rape was really just second-degree coercion. So he got out quickly, and when he did, police say this same man sexually attacked 5 other people in the Bronx. He even tried to rape a homeless woman at 10 in the morning. Okay. So in another case, a career criminal who was arrested 3 times in 4 months for serious crimes, including assault and aggravated harassment, skipped court. And when police finally found him and hauled him to court, Bragg's office let him go in January of last year. Guess what he did when he got out? He murdered a woman.
A growing makeshift memorial in front of a New York City apartment building honoring Christina Yuna Lee after police say a man followed her home and attacked her, stabbing her to death. This security video obtained by NBC News appears to show Lee being followed by the suspect. When they arrived, the door was barricaded. When cops went into the apartment, investigators say they found the body of a 35-year-old woman, later identified as Lee, in her bathroom, and the suspect covered in blood. Police say Osama Nash was arrested and charged with Lee's murder. This was his 8th arrest since May of 2021.
What's interesting is that no one cares. Where's Joe Scarborough in that? Is he upset about it? Is his wife upset? Power to women? Right. All the arch feminists who should be out there defending women, they don't care at all. So here you have a DA who treats violent felonies like they're misdemeanors, even when it gets people killed, who's unleashing criminals on the population, but then spending all of his time trying to destroy his political opponents. In this case, elevating a misdemeanor charge to a felony for the purpose of taking down Trump. Now, here's what we think, if there is an indictment, will form the core of the charge. Bragg seems to be alleging that Trump violated New York's Business Record Act by falsely reporting the payout to Stormy Daniels as, quote, legal fees. Now, if this were true, it would constitute a misdemeanor, and the statute of limitations has already run out for that, for the bookkeeping error, assuming it even happened. But Bragg apparently is thinking about charging Trump under a felony version of the business records law, one that punishes businesses for falsifying records as a way to commit another separate crime. That would be the campaign finance violation, which, as we mentioned, was not a campaign finance violation, and we know that from the FEC, which polices campaign finance violations. And by the way, if it were, then that would be a federal crime, not something that Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, would be prosecuting. The whole thing doesn't make any sense at all. On a legal level, on a political level, it does, because Trump is running for president. So what's behind this? Is he acting alone? We may soon find out. Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio, who sits in the House Judiciary Committee, is calling on Bragg to testify before the Congress. He wants to hear Bragg explain whether or not he's had any contact with the White House or the Biden DOJ. And if he has, maybe that will explain these charges. He also wants to know whether this prosecution will use any federal funds. Let's hope Alvin Bragg, who is committed to the rule of law, complies or is forced to comply very soon. But no matter what happens, if this indictment arrives, no matter who you voted for or plan on voting for, make no mistake, this is a turning point for the country. Now, the headline here is not that they're being unfair to Donald Trump again, though of course they are, or even that Trump is the former president of the United States. Who cares? I mean, though as long as we are indicting retired presidents, where are the charges against George W. Bush for invading Iraq under false pretenses and giving permanent normalized trade relations to China, which completely wrecked our economy? Where are those charges? Don't hold your breath. In Washington, wrecking your own country is not considered a crime. And of course, George W. Bush knows that well, which is why he doesn't seem worried at all. Criticizing the ruling class, that's what they indict you for. But either way, Donald Trump's former job as president of the United States is not really the point here. Yes, of course you can indict former presidents if they've done something wrong. That's not what this is about. The headline here is that there is, as noted, a presidential race in progress right now. And if you check the polls, you will find that Trump is leading the Republican field. That's the unprecedented thing. Taking out your opponent using the justice system. If the Democratic Party is allowed to do this, allowed to crush the presidential frontrunner, the main threat to their power, with a bogus criminal case, where does that leave us? We're done. Because that precedent will live forever. And voters will never again determine the outcome of a presidential election. It's remarkable when you think about it. So after all the yelling from permanent Washington about January 6th and how it was a threat to our democratic norms and the peaceful transfer of power. They've decided to completely short-circuit our democratic norms, not to mention the peaceful transfer of power, using the courts and prosecutors. What happens if they get away with this? No one seems to be thinking this through. Everyone's all spun up, but what happens if they get away with this? If they use the Justice Department, in full view of everyone, to settle a political score and to keep the White House, just to take a guy out of the race who seems to be doing fairly well? We'll destroy the justice system. And that's not a small thing. A functioning justice system has kept this country peaceful for hundreds of years. The purpose of a justice system is to administer justice so that citizens don't have to do it themselves. You outsource that duty to the government. But what happens when you take that away? When there is no justice system? What happens when the Department of Justice decides that its goal is not justice, but protecting the ruling class at all costs? Think about that. People are still going to demand justice. The desire for justice is an inherent human desire. We are born with it. But if there's no neutral place to do it, some people will decide they're going to have to do it themselves. Ooh. Now, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but we can say for certain it's going to be really ugly. So they hate Donald Trump. Fine. But they don't get to destroy America's justice system because they do. We would never recover from that. Robert Costello was legal advisor to former Trump attorney Michael Cohen, who made the payment to Stormy Daniels. He joins us tonight. Mr. Costello, thank you so much for coming on. So, as noted, we can't know whether there'll be an indictment or what's in it. But from the leaks that you have read in, say, the New York Times, how do you assess this case?
Weak, to say the least. I just spent 2 hours or so testifying before the grand jury in downtown Manhattan, and I got my point across, although it was clear to me that the Manhattan DA's office did not want to get to the truth. I need to explain that a little bit. I called them up after I saw Michael Cohen on TV stating things that he said he was going to tell the grand jury and had told the grand jury that were contrary to what he told us when we first represented him in April of 2018. So I'm sitting at home watching these lies, and I said, I've got to do something about it. I don't represent Donald Trump, but I do stand for justice, and I think I have a legal obligation to inform both sides. So that's what I did. I had a ton of documents that I had prepared back in 2019 for the Department of Justice. The U.S. Attorney's Office called me up and said, Mr. Costello, we would like to talk to you about your representation of Michael Cohen. I laughed and said, can I presume you have a waiver of the attorney-client privilege? And they said, you presume correctly. I said, fine, send it over. I'll be delighted to talk to you. That waiver is very clear. And once we had that, I prepared 330 emails, a bunch of text messages. I prepared a contemporaneous report of our first meeting with Michael Cohen at the Regency Hotel in Manhattan, as well as a contemporaneous notes of the interview I had for 2 hours with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, as well as contemporaneous notes of an interview by the House Committee on Intelligence, who sent 3 investigators to my office, one of whom is now Dan Goldman, a congressman here in New York. So I had all of this material ready. I sent it to Donald Trump's lawyer, and I sent it to the Manhattan DA's office. And I contacted the Manhattan DA's office, and I asked, could we meet with Alvin Bragg? Because I wanted to present this to Alvin Bragg as I had presented it to the Southern District. I wanted him to look me in the eye and assess my credibility. Did I have more credibility than Michael Cohen? Because Michael Cohen, in my opinion, was lying about just about everything. I specifically told them that there were 2 main points that I wanted to make clear. That Cohen had told us that when we first met him, that he was suicidal. Why is that important? Because when you're suicidal, thinking that that's the only way out of your legal mess, and you're presented with the following options, that you can cooperate against Donald Trump and provide information that would get you a get-out-of-jail-free card, and you respond to us, I do not have any information on Donald Trump. And he said it many times during that 2-hour meeting. I swear to God, Bob, I don't have anything on Donald Trump. And I had my law partner who knew Michael Cohen for 10 years on Columbia Grammar and Prep School here in Manhattan, because Cohn was on the board of directors.
Yeah.
And when I heard him say that he was suicidal the weekend before, standing on the roof of the Regency Hotel, I didn't know whether he was a drama queen or telling the truth. So I looked at my partner, and he shook his head and nodded, I think he's telling the truth. And later on, we had that corroborated by the Reverend Jerry Falwell and his wife, who had dinner with Michael Cohn, who told him the same thing. Why is that important? Because when you're willing to give up your life in order to avoid these legal troubles, when they're insurmountable to you, and you're offered a way out, so all you have to do is cooperate on Donald Trump. Do you have anything on Donald Trump? And he says no repeatedly. I swear to God, Bob, I don't have anything. Then you know that you've got a guy who probably doesn't have anything. It's certainly easier to give up information on Donald Trump than it is to kill yourself. On top of that, while he's making these speeches during a 2-hour period, he's marching up and down on the other side of the conference table like a tiger in the zoo, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. He looked like he hadn't slept in 5 days. He looked like somebody who was suicidal. And every once in a while, he would stop and point at us. And when I say once in a while, he did this at least 20 times and said, guys, I want you to know, I will do whatever the F I have to do. I will never spend 1 day in jail. Now, what he's saying is, I'll lie, cheat, steal, shoot somebody. I will not spend a day in jail. Do you think a guy whose mentality is that is going to not admit that he has information on Donald Trump? But having said that, the DA's office didn't ask me questions to bring that up. And I brought it up anyway. I ignored their questions and simply gave them the information. I'm hearing rap in my ear, left and right. I'll continue if you want, but
let me just ask you one final question, if it's okay, Mr. Cassell.
Sure.
If you were the DA, if you were a prosecutor and you were trying to be fair and honest and serve the law rather than a political agenda, you'd want to know that, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. And I told them and told the grand jury today, I was deputy chief of the criminal division of the U.S. Attorneys for the Southern District. I said I wouldn't touch a witness like Michael Cohn for any amount of money. You simply cannot rely upon this guy. And tonight, he was on another station denying that he waived the attorney-client privilege. Here it is, in writing, and that's his signature on the second page. So
that's unbelievable.
I guess he didn't know that, and the district attorney didn't know that. And I told them, Michael Cohn has been in your office 20 times and twice in the grand jury, and he forgot to tell you that he waived the attorney-client privilege 22 times? I mean, really, is this the kind of witness you want to ride to the finish line? Not in my book.
I think all they care about is the finish line. But I sure appreciate the information that you brought us tonight.
You're
Robert
quite
Cassell,
welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Harmeet Dillon is the founder and managing partner of Dillon Law Group. She joins us tonight. Harmeet, thanks so much for coming on. I think you would agree that the case, at least as it's been described in the leaks to the New York Times and the Washington Post, seems ridiculous. Is there any indication that there's coordination with the Biden White House or DOJ on this?
Well, look, Tucker, thanks for having me. Two of my partners are involved in this case on President Trump's side and have been meeting with the prosecutors here. So most of what we've been able to divine about this case has been by reading the entrails. That is the New York Times, which is the favorite source to leak to of New York law enforcement. And so we don't know exactly what they're aiming for, but as we can see from Robert Costello's statements just now, it appears to be divorced from what the facts are and more about what the agenda is. And so this prosecution, if it comes through, is absolutely baseless. It's ludicrous. It has been rejected not only by the FEC, as you mentioned, but also by federal prosecutors and also by prior prosecutors of New York State. So this is really well past its sell-by date, It does not fly in court. It is frivolous. And what you are looking at really, Tucker, is the mother of all election interference here, like you said in your lead into this segment. And so what I can also say is that prosecutors are meant to do not just what they can get away with in court, but they're meant to do justice. And is this justice? So there were apparently at least 10 prosecutors sitting in the room yesterday, or last week rather, when this presentation was made. So that's the amount of manpower that they're putting to hear from lawyers, hear from witnesses. At the same time in New York, when the real status is absolutely falling apart there. So I hope for the sake of this country and for the sake of the citizens' and voters' confidence in our legal system that this doesn't come to pass, because it will absolutely be catastrophic for public confidence and for the rule of law in this country.
I think that's it. I think that's the point right there. It all falls apart when you use your justice system to prosecute political grudges. Harmeet Dillon, thank you so much for that. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So the White House briefing room is filled with toadies whose whole job is to bolster whatever lie the Biden administration spoon feeds them. There is at least one man there, though, the best reporter in Africa who asks real questions, Simon Atiba. Today, Simon Atiba was the center of the most chaotic moment in the recent history of the White House press briefings. He joins us after the break to tell us what happened. If you want to know what a complete sham, what a fraudulent, grotesque perversion of reality the White House briefings have become, you should see what happened today. The low IQ White House press secretary brought in a bunch of TV actors to stand there so she could promote a TV show for some reason. Why are we doing this again? She never really explained. Mental Health Day or something. None of them were doctors. But at the same time, even as she was promoting a TV show, the White House press secretary refused to take questions from actual reporters. First on that list would be our friend Simon Atiba of Today News Africa. So today, Atiba just got frustrated and called out the White House press secretary for ignoring his actual questions for months. Watch what happened next.
Just occurred this last 10, 15 minutes is unacceptable. It is unacceptable. So we're either going to continue the briefing, or we can just end the briefing right here.
Outrageous doesn't even describe what we just played for you. So here you have the White House press secretary, whose job it is to answer questions from journalists on behalf of the entire American population, hijacking the event to promote a TV show, and then screaming at a guy who wants his questions answered. And then the other shills in the room don't take the side of their fellow journalists, but take the side of the lady at the front to whom they are actually beholden and try and shut down Simon Atiba. Who did that? Well, this is a partial list. That would include Jeff Mason of Reuters, who should be ashamed, Brian Karam of CNN, Associated Press correspondent Zeke Miller. He even apologized to the press secretary later in the press conference. They, again, should be ashamed of themselves. And previous generations of reporters would have turned on them. Really, you're taking her side? She's a liar? Your job is not to suck up to power. It's to serve your viewers and readers by getting to the truth. But instead, they piled on Simon Atiba. Really the most revealing moment maybe ever in the White House press room. We are honored now to be joined by Simon Atiba himself. Simon, thank you so much for coming on. We're really glad to have you. What prompted, you seem very frustrated there. What prompted your exchange with the press secretary?
Yes, thank you, Tucker. Thank you for having me on your show. I'm grateful. You know, the First Amendment protects the freedom of speech, the press, and assembly, and the right to petition your government to seek redress. Yes. And that First Amendment says that I have the right to ask questions, to do my job, and the press secretary doesn't need to like me, date me, marry me, have 2 black children with me. She doesn't need all that. She doesn't even need to like my accent, doesn't need to like what I look like, where I come from. They look down on me. They don't respect the First Amendment. And so what has been happening in the White House is, in the past 7 months, I've done all the right things. I've not been called on. I've gone to her office to seek a meeting. She said that she will meet with me next year. I've sent questions about the Nigerian election, about, the problems, challenges in Africa. And they've not called on me, even as the vice president is going to Africa, even as the first lady, Jill Biden, went to Africa, even when they received 50 African leaders for the U.S.-African Summit in Washington, D.C., the guy who covers the White House, the African guy who covers the White House, is looked down upon in the greatest country in the world, in the most advanced country where freedom of speech is protected. It's a shame what happened today. One of the guys that you showed there now, Brian, he was kicked out of the WACA because he became violent in the Rose Garden. It's a disgrace. It's very violent. He attacks many people. It's a shame. what happened to me today, it's a total disgrace, and it's happening in the Biden White House. And you know, when it happens to Jim Acosta of CNN, because they respect him, he's white, he works for CNN, I'm black, I'm African, I don't have money, they look down on me, I don't have the opportunities that they have, and they don't treat me the same way. I need to do my job. The freedom of speech and the press in the U.S. allows me to do my job, and that's the only thing that I'm trying to do. And they are stonewalling me, trying to help Karine Jean-Pierre, and it's a shame.
The fact that Jeff Mason and the rest, who should be ashamed of himself, took the White House side against you is really one of the most awful things I've ever seen. I was shocked by it, as cynical as I am, and I appreciate your coming on tonight. You seem unbowed. Simon Atiba, we are rooting for you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So they'll lecture you endlessly on TV, all the smart people. We really care about Ukraine. You really care about Ukraine, right? Over 100,000 dead in Ukraine. And for the second time, the White House has shut down an attempted ceasefire. They want this war to continue. We'll cut to tails straight ahead. The Biden administration's reckless interference in the war in Ukraine has pushed China together with Russia, thereby ending for all time American global dominance. And as if to rub it in our faces, the president of China, President Xi, met with Vladimir Putin in Moscow today. He went there in part to broker a ceasefire in the conflict. You can be opposed to Russia and China getting together, but if you care about Ukraine, you probably want this war to end. But this administration wants to keep it going. Here's spokesflack John Kirby explaining.
If they call for a ceasefire, you believe Ukraine should and will reject that?
Yes, we do, and we would reject it as well. We think that that's an unacceptable outcome right now. Obviously, we want the fighting to stop. We want the war to be over. And as I said, it could end today if Mr. Putin would do the right thing. But the call for a ceasefire right now basically ratifies what they've been able to grab inside Ukraine and gives them time and space to prepare for future operations. And that's just not going to be acceptable.
Right. So this is the second time the Biden administration has stopped any attempt to end the war, negotiated end, not immediate frozen in place, but trying to end it. It's the second time, because the point, of course, is regime change in Russia. Now, Trump has taken a lot of flack recently, but on foreign policy, he is a lot clearer thinking than Joe Biden or his little spokesperson you just saw. Here is Trump's assessment of what's going on in Ukraine. We're quoting. The greatest threat to Western civilization today is not Russia. It's probably more than anything else ourselves and some of the horrible USA-hating people who represent us. Glenn Greenwald is host of System Update on Rumble. He joins us tonight to assess this. Glenn, thanks for coming on. For the second time that we know of, the Biden administration has shut down any attempt to reach a brokered ceasefire. Why do you think that is?
From the very beginning, it's been clear that the U.S. wants this war to continue and wants it to go on for as long as possible because they have no interest in protecting Ukraine. They instead want to sacrifice Ukraine, have Ukraine destroyed in order to advance what they think is the United States' political interest, geopolitical interest of weakening Russia. And the way to do that is to use Ukraine as a pawn, kill as many Ukrainians as possible, destroy their whole country if they have to, in order to prolong the war as long as possible. And the response of the U.S. government and its defenders has been, we don't have any position about when the war ends. That's completely up to the Ukrainians. When they want to end the war, they can end the war. If they don't, we'll support them. And the lie just got revealed. If you listen to what John Kirby said, they asked him, are the Ukrainians willing to have a ceasefire? And he said, not only won't they, we won't allow it either. Essentially admitting finally what's long been obvious, that the country funding the war, providing the arms for the war, which is the United States, determines if and when the war ends, and we obviously don't want that war to end.
How are people who are pushing for the sacrifice of more Ukrainian and Russian children, for whatever it's worth, how did they seize the moral high ground in this conversation? They're monsters. How are they allowed to lecture the rest of us about human rights?
So there's a propagandistic narrative from the beginning that the Ukrainians are feisty, courageous, and are fighting for their own country, and we ought to stand by their side. The reality is the complete opposite. The Ukrainians do not want this war to continue. Zelensky is not using a voluntary army. He's using a conscript army. He is drafting these people who are unwilling to fight and has repeatedly in the last 4 months on 3 occasions increased the punishments for desertion or for people who are otherwise rebelling against this war because the Ukrainians know that they're being used as cannon fodder for the interest of other people around the world. So it's a conscript army. They're forcing these Ukrainians to go and die in huge numbers for things that are not in their interest. What's in their interest is to negotiate with the Russians over an agreement that will allow Ukraine to keep the parts of their country that want to be ruled by Kiev, and it's the United States and Great Britain that are blocking it purely for our own interests.
Yeah, and then they're lecturing you. Right. Glenn Greenwald, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for that analysis. So you tune into hockey games to watch people play hockey, but on Saturday night, an NHL team out of nowhere started pushing trans activism on Twitter. It makes you wonder what's going on in the National Hockey League. We've got details after the break. Daniels, big things are happening. Biggest of all is life expectancy in the United States going in the wrong direction. One of the drivers of that is health. Americans have a lot more chronic health issues than they used to. Very few people have commented on this or thought about why it's happening. Mark Hyman is a physician and the exception to this. Really an amazing person if you're not familiar with him. He's got a new book out called Young Forever, The Secrets to Living Long, Healthy Lives. We talked to Mark Hyman on many recommendations. You got to talk to Mark Hyman. So we did for a brand new episode of Tucker Carlson Today. Here's part of it.
We have developed a medical system based on historical phenomena, which is you have a headache, you go to the head doctor. You have a stomach ache, you go to the stomach doctor. It seemed logical, except biology isn't organized that way. It's not the way the body's organized. The body is a system. So rather than treat each individual part, each individual symptom, we treat the root causes and we create health. So functional medicine is the science of creating health as opposed to the science of treating disease. And when you create health, disease goes away as a side effect. We have our whole concept of disease wrong, that it's some entity, a thing that we catch, like a cold.
Yes, that's
or
exactly
COVID,
right.
But it's not like that.
Like someday you just get it.
Yeah, I get heart disease, or I got diabetes, or I get cancer, I get dementia, or I get whatever, autoimmune disease. No, there are really clear causes for these problems that are rooted in things that we now know that we haven't translated into medical practice. And for every 10% of your calories is ultra-processed food, your risk of death goes up by 14%. And our diet is 60% ultra-processed food, and kids is 67%. It's a national emergency, honestly. I mean, there's 6 million people that die from COVID globally, but 11 million people die every year from bad food.
That's an amazing conversation, even if you love pizza and Oreos, as some of us do. Dr. Mark Hyman, tomorrow, 7 a.m. on Fox Nation. You can stream it. So something is really wrong in the National Hockey League, really wrong. On Saturday, the San Jose Sharks, owned by venture capitalist Hasso-Plattner, hosted effectively a trans appreciation night. Players were told to wear jerseys signifying that they don't believe in biological reality. One of them does, the goalie, and he refused on religious grounds. Apparently, in response to that, the San Jose Sharks' official Twitter account began posting true lunacy about gender. And we're not making this up. You should look it up. For example, and we're quoting, worldwide, gender diversity is seen far differently than that in the Western world. The Muxe gender is a respected third gender in Zapotec cultures in Oaxaca, Mexico, that has existed for centuries. Ooh, thank you, National Hockey League team. What the hell are they talking about? Well, Greg Price of the State Freedom Caucus Network decided to Google it, and he found out that the Zapotecs, who lived in southern Mexico, were known for a lot more than 3 genders. Like almost every Mesoamerican culture, human sacrifice was at the very center of their world. They put children to death as offerings to their gods. As Price put it, quote, the San Jose Sharks want us to take cultural advice from an ancient Mexican civilization that participated in child sacrifice. What the hell is going on in the NHL? And why are owners doing this, and how long will fans stick with it? They just want to watch hockey. Scary. We'll be right back.
A big day. It's a big day for the Irish. And the President of the United States would like to wish all of you a happy St. Patrick's, the thing. Joe Biden loves St. Patrick's Day because he's told us for decades he's Irish. He's even in the Irish American Hall of Fame. His Secret Service code name is Celtic. That's how Irish he is. And Joe Biden's proud of that. Here he was today with the Irish Prime Minister.
Every St. Patrick's Day, every Irishman goes out to find another Irishman to make a speech to. Well, that's why I'm here. I, like all of you, take pride in my Irish ancestry. And as long as I can remember, it's been sort of part of my soul, how I've been raised.
He takes pride in his ancestry, but he did go on to joke that he's not really Irish because, well, he's sober and his family isn't in jail. At least not yet. Because get it? The Irish drink and they get arrested a lot. Watch.
I'd been to Ireland many times, but not to actually look up to find my actual family members. And there were so many, and they actually weren't in jail. They were all, but all kidding aside, I met the Blewitts and the Finnegans and all of the folks who we're related to. I'm the only Irishman you ever met, though, that's never had a drink, so I'm okay. I'm really not Irish.
Well, watching all this, you have to wonder how Joe Biden's countrymen in the Puerto Rican community are thinking tonight. For years, Joe Biden has told us that Puerto Ricans raised him. And yet, here he is giving all the credit to the Irish. They probably feel pretty slighted in Puerto Rico. Or maybe they're relieved. Either way, the facts of Joe Biden's biography are getting harder and harder to pin down. You see, it's not just the Puerto Ricans who are being airbrushed away. What about all the Poles? I mean, the Greeks, who played key roles in Joe Biden's upbringing? See, when it's not St. Patrick's Day, Joe Biden talks about them a lot.
You know, I grew up in a heavily Irish Catholic community in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and a heavily Italian Polish community in Claremont, Delaware. I also want to acknowledge someone else who means a great deal to our family. Rabbi Michael Beals of the congregation Best Shalom in Wilmington, Delaware. That's where I received my education. I probably went to shul more than many of you did. You all think I'm kidding. We have a very, in relative terms, large Puerto Rican population in Delaware. I was sort of raised in the Puerto Rican community at home. I got my education for real in the black church. And that's not hyperbole, it's a fact. I'm an honorary Greek, not only today, but every day.
Black, Puerto Rican, Greek, Pole, Italian, Jewish, Puerto Rican. I think I said that one twice. We're just going to have to take Joe's word for it because it's Friday, and it's also kind of funny to imagine this Benetton of an upbringing if it were true, even though it's clearly not true. So we got to ask, how does a Puerto Rican, Greek, Irishman celebrate St. Patty's Day? Well, we've been able to identify that Joe Biden has something of a tradition for this holiday. First, he makes fun of the Irish, while at the same time bragging about himself. Here was Joe Biden last year, for example.
Bless me, Father, for I'm about to sin. Well, I just want you to know, I may be Irish, but I'm not stupid.
I may be Irish, but I'm not stupid. That was last year. This year, I may be Irish, but I'm not drunk and in jail. Joe Biden's been at this for a while, so the subtlety of his insults is gone. But back in the day, Joe Biden was more clever. He found more inventive ways to slight his Irish guests. On St. Patrick's Day back in 2010, for example, Biden memorialized the mother of Ireland's prime minister, even though she was very much alive.
The Taoiseach knows a lot about it. His mom lived in Long Island for 10 years or so. God rest her soul. And although your mom's still alive as your dad passed. God bless her soul. I got to get this straight.
It's a big one to not have straight. You can feel, it's electric, Joe Biden's enthusiasm for St. Patrick's Day in these videos. It's infectious, in fact, as Kamala Harris told us today. Joe Biden's love of this holiday is authentic. And of course, no one is better to judge authenticity than Kamala Harris. Watch.
As you all know, Vice President Biden, this was one of his most particular joys as Vice President. And as you all know, he is quite exuberant in that joy, and I now have caught the bug.
Joe Biden takes St. Patrick's Day seriously. I really can't talk. I use my hands a lot to talk. But how seriously does Joe Biden take St. Patrick's Day? We can't confirm this, but there are reports tonight that Biden's famous showdown with Corn Pop resulted from Mr. Pop not having the proper reverence for St. Patrick's Day. He refused to wear green, and Irish Joe had no choice but to teach him a lesson.
And Corn Pop was a bad dude. And he ran a bunch of bad boys. He said, I'll be waiting for you. He was waiting for 3 guys in straight razors. Not a joke. And he cut off a 6-foot length of chain. He folded up. He said, you walk out with that chain. And you walk to the car and say, you may cut me, man, but I'm going to wrap this chain around your head.
That truly is one of the greatest hits of politics. That clip never gets old. It is solid gold. Now, again, we cannot be sure that Corn Pop had offended Joe Biden's Irish, Puerto Rican, Greek, Polish, Italian ancestry. But it's starting to look like the most likely theory. And Chadwick Moore, with The Spectator, is here with us now to assess. Chadwick, on an attempted somewhat more serious note, Chadwick, this is the administration of cultural appropriation and social justice. This is the administration that's here to teach us about racial justice.
Yeah, I mean, if half of Biden's voters, if their grandfather said the things that Biden has said in his past about, racial jungles and segregation and saying that gay people are national security threats and shouldn't be teachers and all that other stuff, they would disown their own grandparents. They'd be shouting at them at the Thanksgiving table, I hope you die. But it's okay for Joe Biden to do it, which of course just exposes their own idiocy and hypocrisy, and they don't really care. I mean, these stories that Joe Biden makes up about his past are so hilarious and ridiculous, most prominently his great lie about seeing a gay couple kiss in like 1932 or whatever, and his father telling him that, love is love. Yeah, I can just hear him now like, well, the Biden family always believed that trans rights are human rights. My grandpappy told me that during the potato famine. Give it a rest, Joe Biden. Nobody's buying it.
Yeah, the gay marriage epiphany was the slowest moving epiphany in history, from 1950 through opposing gay marriage in the early 2010s. It just took 60 some odd years, but it was an epiphany for Joe Biden. Chadwick, look, we could dismiss this as the tangled web of lies of one old man, but the truth is it also fits into, for example, Justin Trudeau wearing blackface or Ralph Northam wearing blackface. It seems to be the takeaway, Chadwick, is maybe this is all for show.
Yeah, and it's so deeply offensive. Like, everyone knows that, like, liberal white guy that puts on, like, a black accent when he talks to black people, and everyone just, or, like Hillary Clinton does. And it's just so offensive and gross and cringe. And it's sort of an effect that this is what Joe Biden does as a default setting. And it's almost like he doesn't really need to, because nobody expects him to be this kind of TikTok social justice warrior he's perhaps pretending to be or thinks he needs to be. It's really just be like the old white guy that's completely corrupt and, using your family to enrich yourself and your position. That's fine. We all get it, Joe Biden. You can't distract us with trying to pretend you're Puerto Rican and black and Jewish and everything else that you are trying to do.
What do they say? It's not a lie if you truly believe it. Do you doubt that Joe Biden believes he is a black, Puerto Rican, Jewish Pole? It could be possible he actually believes these things. Chadwick Moore of The Spectator, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, March Madness, it's underway. And Howard University made its first appearance in the tournament since 1992. Sadly, they didn't last long. Howard was blown out in the first round by Kansas, and that wasn't even really the worst part of the night for the Bisons. Moments after getting destroyed on the court, Howard took another loss when Vice President Kamala Harris entered the locker room. She addressed the players who had just lost the biggest game of their lives as if they had just failed to complete their first day of kindergarten. Watch.
You played hard. You played to the very last second. You made all us Bisons so proud. You hustled out there. You are smart. You are disciplined. You put everything you had into the game. And that's what it's about, right? Until the last minute. You guys did that. So you keep playing with chin up and shoulders back. Because you showed the world who Bison are. Right? I mean, literally what you have done is in historic proportion. I was at Howard back in the day where we were just happy that there was a game. much less get into this place.
Coach, I'd rather get blown out by 40 by Kansas than have to put up with that punishment. No confirmed reports that that was said after the speech, but you saw it. By the way, Kamala Harris was in attendance for the game, and fans booed her. Dan Dockich is a former player and head coach for the Indiana University of Hoosiers, and he's also the former head coach at Bowling Green State University. He currently hosts the show Don't At Me for Outkick, and Dan joins us now. Did you ever have such, a passionately inspiring, motivational speech, Dan, in all your years at Bowling Green or Indiana?
When I was with Coach Knight, we just used to throw things, Will, and then we'd figure it out later. All right, look, we all know that Kamala Harris is a god-awful public speaker. In fact, I always think she's high on something, I swear to God. But I got to tell you, that's a tough speech. Well, that is a tough speech if you're a coach. I'm trying to be fair here. That's a tough speech. If you're a celebrity, you come in, you're asked to speak to a bunch of kids that just lost by 28 points. You know what they want to do? They want to get out of there. But I got to tell you, she's the worst public speaker I think ever in politics. I almost want to take Joe Biden out of it. And by the way, you had me rolling with, you're wondering how his fellow Puerto Rican countrymen were taking his love of his Irish heritage. I was rolling here. But that's a tough speech. She talks to people like they're in kindergarten. She loves her own jokes. I would be sitting there going, man, come on. But I will say this. I thought the Howard kids showed class. I thought they were fantastic. I thought they sat there. They were respectful. And I did like at the end that she invited the Howard team to come to the White House. I did think that was cool. But man, oh man, that's a bad speaker. How is that a vice president speaking like that?
You know, Dan, I love your search for fairness. I truly do. Because when I think of fairness, I think of Dan Dockich. And I love your pursuit of fairness. If this were one one-off bad speech by Winston Churchill, I think we could forgive the moment. Right. It is a tough moment, to your point. I don't know what Coach Knight would have said. To your point, he might have thrown a chair. But this is part of the record for Kamala Harris. This is she speaks to everyone like they're in second grade or in kindergarten. And you have to wonder what she's waiting on. It's like an applause line that she got on Colbert or an applause line she got during a vice presidential debate that she now thinks is coming at every moment, and it's always unearned. It's missing.
Yeah, well, she has no charisma. She has no sense of timing. And then one of the beautiful things about her is she loves her own jokes. My show is on Outkick. It's from 9 to 11. You've been a guest. But the content we get from Kamala Harris or whatever her name is unbelievable, because every time she sits there, every time she's in some type of public speaking, a dinner, maybe it's an event, she gives you content, Will, because it's awful. She is a content machine, and it is always the same thing. Gibberish, word salad, laughing at your own jokes, and speaking to whomever it is like they just started. You said kindergarten. I'll give them second or third grade.
Well, how, again, fair of Dan Dockich. He said it himself, but it's 9 to 11 Eastern time at Outkick. It's Don't At Me, where in his pursuit of fairness, he has seen the light and known that at least after one game in the tournament, the Texas Longhorns are a real national championship contender. Dan Dockich, always good to see you. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, my friend.
All right, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot is on her way out the door. A lot of people are thrilled about that, including Chicago journalist William J. Kelly. He just unloaded on Lori Lightfoot at a city council meeting. You've got to see that, hear that. He's going to be with us straight ahead. Well, now the Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot has lost re-election. She'll be leaving office soon. And a lot of journalists in the city are thrilled about that because Lightfoot waged a war on press freedom. At one point, she even refused to let white reporters interview her. Lightfoot also pulled the press credentials of reporter William J. Kelly because she didn't like his reporting. On Wednesday, at a city council meeting, Kelly gave Lightfoot this send-off.
The people of Chicago elected you. You shut down our schools, you shut down the churches, you shut down the businesses. You did the one thing that I thought could never happen. As somebody who was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, I never thought in my life that I would ever see the city of Chicago brought down so low as you have managed to bring it down. Shame on you. That is a legacy that you are going to have to carry. Future historians are going to have a hard time understanding how you ever even became mayor of the city of Chicago. I hope that you realize what damage you have done to the city. I hope that after today's city council meeting, you will pack your suitcase and get the hell out of my city.
Going to be getting the hell out of office, that's for sure. William J. Kelly is a journalist in Chicago, and he joins us now. William, great to have you on the program. I can't help but notice that was a city council meeting. It wasn't a press briefing. It wasn't a Q&A. That looked like a public comment. Why was that the circumstances of your statement to Mayor Lori Lightfoot?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Will. Well, yeah, like everything else in the city of Chicago now, it's, Mission Impossible meets Kobayashi Maru. We had, traditionally, Mayor Lightfoot would do a press conference after every city council meeting. But, of course, this being her last city council meeting, due to the fact that she lost her re-election campaign, she canceled her city council press conference. So I knew that if I was going to have a chance to speak to her at all, I would have to register for the public comment section. and that's exactly what I did. It was a lottery. Only 5 people, only 5 names were drawn from a big glass bowl. And miraculously, mine was one of them.
Right.
And I was given 3 minutes and, 60 seconds worth the distance run times 3.
Luck of the Irish there, but not without effort. You had to enter the lottery to get a chance to speak to your mayor. Why was this so important for you to say what you said to Lightfoot?
Well, it was extremely important, Will, because over the course of the last few years, a number of people have contacted me, reached out to me, and said, here's a question I would like for you to ask the mayor. Here's something I would like you to say. Police officers who had been overworked and obviously mistreated, and a spike in police suicides as a result. And I feel like this particular city council meeting was the last chance that I may ever have to actually tell Mayor Lori Lightfoot not just what was on my mind, but what was on the minds of so many Chicagoans. And I'm just thankful that I had the opportunity to do it.
And I heard in that moment where you told her you hope the history is written accurately, that you intend to write that book, that you intend to write the history of these years in Chicago. We could hear that in the video clip of your appearance there in the city council. What we cannot hear, William, is the response of the mayor or the council. What did they say to you at the end of your statement?
Well, to add insult to injury, after I'm done giving my public comment or victim impact statement is how I actually viewed it, one of Mayor Lightfoot's city council allies heckled me. She actually said, she called me a derogatory name, and then she said that all of the problems that Mayor Lori Lightfoot, had to handle or mishandle was the result of the pandemic. And I guess channeled the entire city of Chicago and let this city council woman know that she was, in fact, the pandemic.
Well, in Chicago, for the moment at least, it looks like there's some relief from the pandemic. We hope that the circumstances in that city, which have been largely made it unlivable for the past several years, are alleviated. And we appreciate you hopping on with us tonight, William J. Kelly, and for that moment in front of Mayor Lori Lightfoot.
Absolutely. Thank you, Will.
All right. People in East Palestine